This week, we have Wilson Kriegel.
Yes, it's great to be here.
I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to go top to bottom, and I'm going to read the bio you sent me.
Oh.
Because after reading this bio, it confirmed the myth. It confirmed the stories that I heard. So Wilson is by far the most interesting man in the world. Chuck Norris has a poster of Wilson in his room. And that's who we're working with today. I'm going to feel free to interject at any time.
Yeah, sure.
At any time. Wilson was born in Paris in 1975 to 5 siblings. Where were you? Were you middle?
I'm third.
Smack in the middle.
Yeah.
The middle child, smack in the middle.
2 older sisters.
2 older sisters and 2 younger.
And then, 3 younger. I have 5 siblings, 2 different marriages. Parents married and divorced 3 times. Very French.
When you were 3 years old, you moved to a farm. No hot water. Just you, the pigs, goats, rabbits. And in the business terms, eat what you kill. You actually had to eat what you kill when talking about food.
Yeah, it was my father's endeavor into farming. And he was very passionate about the land because he actually grew up extremely poor, was abandoned, and then ended up basically just having a cow. And so they had so little money, he would have to walk the cow the length of the road so he could graze on the side of the road because they didn't have a field to put it in. And he was exposed to cows and horses as a means of dealing and coping with his disease and not going to school and his traumas. And then that gave him a passion for the land and animals. And that was really we moved away from Paris, where he was a developer in real estate or early stages, to a farm that he wanted to grow in the context of the only place where he could find some humanity for himself. And he ended up being an enormous rancher in America.
Whoa.
Yeah.
Well, so growing up around that was, and we were talking about before the show, we were talking about just, formative years, but we were talking about formative years as like an infant and a toddler.
Yeah.
But now we're talking about actually formative years as a child, being around all this change and all this, we'll even say, entrepreneurial growth.
Yeah. Yeah, my father was very entrepreneurial at everybody else's expense. He had a lot of trauma, and he had a big chip on his shoulder. And I would say that, narcissism was one of his strong traits, which happens often. And he was going to make himself know what it was going to cost. And he did that at any cost. And he did immigrate to America with $1 in his pocket and no education, no junior high, no high school, no college. And he was very intentional on pursuing the American dream. He didn't speak English. Couldn't write. He had no writing skills. He thought in his mind, which was in '82, that if he had made $1 million in cash, he would have succeeded. Ultimately, men like that, fairly void of empathy and relatability to others, kind of never stop. That's their journey. So he's quite a talented entrepreneur.
So let me ask you, knowing how he was back then, back in the late 70s, early 80s, how do you think he would have dealt with social media and the pressures of hearing how his mind was? How do you think he would have dealt with the pressures of social media and that being a parameter of success?
Yeah, so my father, I think every true...
Have you ever thought about that?
No, he was very controlling to information. And if you look at the biggest and the top entrepreneurs are all very controlling of their information. I think people who pursue a lot of exposure early on are pursuing validation. I don't think you see a Zuck, you see a Steve Jobs, you see a Elon. They're not pursuing, Elon now, but Elon early days, never. Right?
Elon
now,
20 years ago.
Yeah, Elon now is like, well, let me buy a platform to bully people. But that's because he was bullied and he has some, parental trauma issues in his childhood and he didn't go to therapy. So he's kind of trying to cope with that now. And I think actually Elon in the past year in particular, you'll see a huge transformation in his having peaked, I would call it, in his narcissistic behaviors.
Say it again?
Elon's peaked in his own way.
Okay.
In his paradigm of growth in relations to having gone all in on one variable, which is to become extremely powerful. In avoidance of any of his humanity, put aside some level of autism that he has, which actually gives him particular skill sets when it comes to operation. Elon is a brilliant operator. His space shuttles existed before that. A lot of what he's done existed before him. But he has a capacity for focus and an aptitude of execution. and an approach to solving problems that's completely differentiated. And he's ruthless around that. I mean, you go to Twitter and you fire 60, 70% of people. I'm not saying that all of them deserve the job or that it was well run.
Yeah.
But you do it with no empathy. You do it with no care.
Zero.
Yeah. And again, and statistically and financially, it didn't work out that well either, right? He's lost half of his valuation on Twitter, and the company's still not profitable, and they're not generating more revenue. So, it's hearsay. Like he's brilliant in his own way. All things have a cost. And I found that hanging out and spending time and learning and growing around very successful, aggressive entrepreneurs and resilient, kind of ruthless people who build billion-dollar companies and multi-billion-dollar companies who repeat that. It comes at an enormous cost. And if you just look at it, I mean, there's a big difference between being 1% and being 0.1%. Big difference.
Huge difference.
Now, people are like, well, 1%, like that's 99% better than everybody else. But like, those are not relevant statistics to people who get to that level because they don't look at that ever. Right? They only look at what's ahead. So there's no comparison to the 99%. That's just not a mind frame or a mindset that people who get to that level think about. There's no comparison. We don't look for that validation.
They're thinking about being the 1% of the 1%.
Yeah, and so what are you talking about to become the best of the best? Not just to be the best, right? Not just be a top 10, but to be Michael Jordan, to be an Elon. Everything is the price, right? So when people are like, well, what's it going to take? It's going to take everything, right? And what's the price of that? Just the price it takes. It's never too much. It is just what it takes. And people who can't really conceive that or process that emotionally are never going to be that. Because what it takes is just what it takes. If you set something and you want to endeavor in making that your reality, then is it ever too much or too hard? There's no such thing as hard or easy. Those are not even variables that you spend time on. Like when I trying to set a speed climb of Denali, which usually takes 20 days and 4 days or less, carrying 80 pounds, and one of the hardest 10 mountains in the world, where it's self-carry, self-rescue, everything. And I said, I'm going to do it in 4 days. And people are like, that's not possible. Well, that's not possible for you, or that's possibly impossible, or high risk, or whatever those things may be. But like, I don't look at those, oh, it's going to be hard. Hard is not even a relevant variable to me.
Absolutely. But do you look at things that are other people look at it as hard? Do you compute how you're going to do it, or you just go at it?
Well, you have to do both.
Right. There has to be a reason why people think like 4 minute mile will never be done.
Right.
Until it was.
Yes.
And then it was done again. And then again and again. And now it's...
You have to love the process. Like, however, there's stages to all this elasticity, right? And it's neuroplasticity. In essence, and it's one of the things that I managed to do at a certain stage of my life, is very aggressively develop my neuroplasticity, which is basically ultimately kind of forcing growth and thus altering your chemicals, right, to expand your brain capacity, right, on an emotional standpoint and intellectual standpoint.
But this is something that needs to be worked on a daily basis.
Constantly.
Right.
Right. And I started actually therapy at 15 because I had
50.
Yeah, 10. 15, sorry.
15. Okay.
Yeah. I had learning disabilities. I had depression, acute anxiety, and I had gone through a lot of trauma.
So you moved to the U.S. when you were 7?
16.
16.
Yeah. I did 2 stages. My father moved in 82. He took us from our mother at the divorce, which was my first kind of foray into trauma. My mother, I was born into love, and I would say that was, kind of forged into the abyss of the darkness thereafter. But realistically, if you do not know love, you do not know how to give or create or receive love. I had the privilege of have an extremely loving mother. It's fundamentally essential to your core and your sense of self and identity of being a valuable human being. It's very hard to have empathy, or it's very hard to experience the beauty of life without actually love and loving or being loving or engaging in that process versus fear.
When was the last time you saw your mother?
I've been together with my mom for 25 years.
Okay.
My mom had a rough life. Never successful, nor did she endeavor in it, but she had an abusive husband after my father, and she had a very traumatic divorce with my father, and he took us. It broke her. She ended up in an insane asylum. She ended up staying poor, and he intentionally never really did anything to help. On the contrary, he was so hurt by their outcome, and he was so betrayed by it. It just reinforced his childhood traumas that he could never trust anybody or rely on anybody or depend on anybody. So he went all in on that. And she managed actually to stay the beautiful human that she was. And it took me probably 35, 40 years to realize that my mother's strength in her humanity was stronger than my father's will and resilience and accomplishments in his success. And it was very kind of a long journey to get to that, to realize that my mother's strength was that she always stayed empathetic. She always stayed loving. She always stayed true to that core, despite all the trauma, despite all the pain, despite all the failure.
And from what I know about you, that seems to be the glue that probably held you together for decade upon decade, while the strength of your father and his entrepreneurship was, we'll say, that the roots and then the tree, but your mother's empathy was the glue that literally held everything together.
Yeah, it's interesting. I would say that, I mean, there's so much fear. There's so much insecurity, inadequacies, triggers along the way of kind of grooming and building
and
yourself.
That's why you go to therapy, and then the therapy helps to kind of open the window and let all the air in and let you understand.
I always say, like, my ability to go back to the abyss and push myself to the breaking points of any commitments that I make.
It's like the flip of a switch.
That's my strength.
Yeah.
I don't fear the dark, right? I just know that life happens as a part of the process in the dark. And you have to be able to embrace that and be vulnerable in that and have the strength and courage of it to actually grow constantly, right? Because on the other side, on the other side of living fear, is being a lesser person, is being lesser than you already were afraid of, right? Of your traumas, of your triggers, of your insecurities, and so if you're not capable of engaging in that, how are you really growing to become more than that versus become that? What I learned from my dad and other fairly successful people, and reading a lot of biographies around individuals like that, is that they become what made them instead of using it to grow from it to become whoever they choose to be versus the identity of it that they've chosen, that they no longer can get, they no longer realize is not their reality, but is who they are.
Right. And I feel like now we have a lot more tools to uncover that. Like back in the late 70s, 80s, let's even say into the 90s, we didn't have, we had books and we had certain people.
I actually think all the way through 2010, I mean, until I grew up without social media. I grew up, and going back to the transparency issue, like I find today's world confusing for kids and confusing for young adults. I think that I
couldn't imagine having kids your age that are exposed to everything on Instagram, YouTube, TikTok, and you not being able to, knowing you probably control it to some extent.
My kids don't have TikTok or Instagram on their
phone. There you go.
Yeah.
But the amount, like the millions upon millions that do, and they're fed whatever that content creator or creators before them had put out there.
Yeah, and more so, it's the balance between parenting at home versus being parented by digital worlds and third parties that are exactly in the same realm that you are, which is trying to figure it out. I mean, I always talk about employees in the office and middle management wants relatability. They want empathy. They want cheering from each other. They want to feel like there are commonalities between them. Find me a founder who's authentic to get to becoming $1 billion company or a billionaire. None of them are. The notion of authenticity equals vulnerability. This word has been overused in the context of...
Say that again?
Authentic. To be authentic, you have to be vulnerable. So find me founders who are vulnerable at the outset, publicly, about their traumas, about their triggers. None of them. I'm sorry, none of them. You're not going to find them. There are nice guys out there. There's guys who are good guys. There's guys who care about people. There are guys who create cultures of, in today's environment or in the last decade in particular, where there's proper benefits, equal pay, better childcare, things like that.
Yep.
Right? Great recognition of employees.
Do you think this is more prevalent in Europe versus the U.S.?
Well, Europe is different. I think there's this funny video online about this Italian guy who speaks about the culture and how that's just embedded in the culture and the history of education and parenting and work. And so I think over there it's actually embedded in the DNA of how people socially and culturally interact. I don't think it's an either or. It comes with it. There's pros and cons to that as well. But I think that, fundamentally, no, employees want leaders. Of course, ultimately, if the leading and the brutality of that process, because it is brutal to build a company, it is brutal to take the risk to be a part of a company. There's a lot of uncertainty. There's a lot of failures. There's a lot of mistakes. There's a lot of times where you're not going to make payroll. I mean, there's nothing glorifying about that. It's nobody wants to see the sausage making. It's an ugly process. Everybody sees the end meal and it looks like a Picasso moment, and you're like, this is fantastic. Yeah, well, that's the angle when it works. And there's 85% failure rate, right? There's 1% less of startups who get funding. You're better off getting married and getting 52% divorce rate. And there's 80% success rate of getting a yes when you propose. Those are pretty good odds. Startups.
Is that a fact?
Yeah, those are all facts.
80% yes when you propose?
Yeah.
Huh.
Right? So, and then 52% success rate.
Yeah.
Which, the other 25% are probably unhappy in their marriages, and there's 20% happy. Yeah, like those are still significantly better odds, and people are engaging that as if it's a no-brainer. Like as if it's like, yeah, I got married, like it's done, I'm done. The marriage is equal to your pre-seed check. It means nothing. Everything else has to be done. You've just started the endeavor, the journey of having to grow two people together to create a family, and then go through a process of life with all the ups and downs and all the changes and all the iterations of it, and actually make that work together. Like the easiest thing you could have done is to get married. So we over-glorify parts of the process that ultimately are the easiest parts, and under-invest and underestimate and under-understand the beauty of the difficulty of the rest that we should learn to love. But we're not ready for it. So when it happens, we're so underprepared. We're so underinvested. We lack so much clarity to where it is we're going and why we're doing it, or who we're doing with, and we don't have the tools. I grew up fairly poor in difficult circumstances, and I've been exposed to all sorts of environments, and lived all these lives in the process. And then I had my second generation siblings. My father had become successful. He would still put us in coach, and then he would have them in business, or he would have them in private school, and we were still going to public school, or he would have nannies. We never had any. And so they grew up rich kids. But
then this is where?
In America.
Well, where in America?
In New York City.
Okay.
Yeah. So rich New York City, wealth New York City.
Well, let's not rewind, but fast forward, and then we're going to rewind.
Yeah.
All of this, which usually I would cut off and then just like go through the process of the show, but I love to hear you riff because everything is just spitting knowledge and spitting truth. What are you doing right now? Like your elevator pitch, like what does Wilson do?
Fundamentally, I just try to live a life worth remembering, where that can only happen in the impact that you have on other people. Otherwise, who remembers you? Nobody cares about your company. Nobody remembers Steve Jobs already. Do you think my 11-year-old, by the time he's 25, remembers Steve Jobs? No, he won't. And that's not to take away from what Steve Jobs accomplished, which can be debated. Do you think he'll know what Microsoft is? No. He doesn't even know who the founders of Microsoft are.
Right. So him.
The point is simply
in terms of like how we look at like big wars of the past, and we look at like the top generals. Steve Jobs will go down as like a top general in the tech war.
Yeah, but even then, his legacy is what? He didn't donate. Nobody cares.
This is his legacy.
Nobody cares.
Because his legacy is the iPad and the iPhone.
It's been overridden by the short-term dynamics of what value is created from it. Shareholder value, marketing value, perception value in society. Cook has done a better job than Steve Jobs is. Steve Jobs' narrative story and origin story is much more fascinating, right? And we, like with Elon, who's got 12 kids and doesn't parent, we tend to kind of glance over people's behaviors on the way to success in America. Why? Because we value individualism, we value capitalism, we value materialism.
Say that again. We value
individualism, capitalism, and basically money and materialism. Yeah,
America.
Yeah, that's America. That's not a value system. I'm not saying there's not value in that.
Right.
I'm just saying that that's not working out very well necessarily all the time. But because we do value that more than anything else, there's an erosion of humanity in us, and there's an erosion of criteria of what's acceptable, and thus corruption is so high on a moral standpoint in this country. I mean, you look in politics, you look in business, you look in society, the lack of integrity just keeps getting worse.
Right, and it also feels like that's just part of life. It's kind of like just throw your hands up. It was, and it is, and it will be.
Yeah, and so in the context of that versus the reality, I want to create an experience for myself, right? I don't care. Like, it's just a fact, and so you kind of have to have the context and understanding of it. So I do read a lot. I do partake in understanding, socioeconomical problems and racial problems and gender problems, and those are all they're real. And they're real and they're important to people in their individual lives. But how I live my life has to do much more with like what life do I want to create? What value and meaning does it have? And what's worth remembering about that when it's all said and done? Because you don't choose when it's all said and done. So the only thing you can choose is who you are in a given moment in time in any context. And so I think a life that we individually experience that is kind of beautiful in its own right is who are we in any given moment? And are we holding ourselves up to that? And where does that lead us in the process of living the journey itself versus end goals and fine lines that are finite that actually don't have any real meaning other than the 10 seconds of dopamine or ego or pride, and then life goes on. And then who are you beyond that? I look at Tom Brady, right? I look, the struggle that people have to move past an identity that they become, right? I have friends who made $300, $400, $500 million in selling them billion-dollar companies. And then they're like, I got to get to $1 billion. And I'm always like, why? Like, well, there's no real why. It's just they don't know what else to do or who else to be. The problem is if you don't know who else to be because you're either afraid of being anything else, because you've anchored yourself into an identity and an engine of that identity that you trust.
Now, when you hear something like that, do you always or never feel the need to interject?
People want your opinions, they'll ask for it.
Right, but if these are your homies...
No, yeah, so I have an opinion.
Yeah.
I have groups of chat rooms with friends, and I have a running club, Pitch and Run, and we have, a couple 100, 200, 300 members, and I'm one of the founders of Pitch and Run, and it's a community around founders, entrepreneurs, venture capitalists, and diversity is amazing, and it's anywhere from 20-year-olds to 50-year-olds and 20-minute, mile pace to, Olympic level mile paces. And the context of that is community.
How often are you guys running?
Twice a week, off the West Side Highway, yeah. And the context of that or any of my chat room is hearing each other out, is listening, is learning, is exposure, it's support. The context is sharing for support. It's not sharing for being right. I don't believe in truth. In itself, I find that to be, a little bit of a, who owns truth? No, there's just the reality of now. Like, this is reality.
Yeah.
Everything else is, who knows? But the only thing that's real right now is what we're doing right now. The presence of us, the experience of this. Contextually, everything else is imaginary, or triggers, or thoughts, or imagination. Like, it's not real. The reality is just what's happening right now. Everything else is what we project on, or assume, or anticipate, or are nervous about.
Do you consider yourself spiritual?
I have faith in life. I'm not a religious person. I actually don't believe in God, which, again, doesn't imply anybody else can't or shouldn't.
But would you refer... So I'm not religious by any means, but I do believe in fate. I do believe that everything happens for a reason. And while I'm not religious, when certain things happen, I call that God.
Okay.
God for me is more happenstance, and the reasoning for why something happened, which will fall into the category of what will be, and that happened for that reason. Like bumping into somebody on a New York City street corner when, if my shoe wasn't untied, I wouldn't have stopped to tie my shoe.
That's the magic of life, yeah.
And 10 seconds, and if I would have been 10 seconds behind, I wouldn't have walked right past my buddy.
Just one text or one turn of the head.
And I call that, I'm like, that's God.
Yeah. No, I've never thought about fate or destiny. I have faith. And sometimes your faith gets eroded and sometimes it's strengthened. And hopefully through the erosion, sometimes, it deepens itself actually to constructing.
And you know what, when we go back to the conversation about social media, there is the positive part about social media. Absolutely. With that stuff.
Yeah.
Like I know you and I both share.
I consume social media. Yeah. But in some ways I grew up with enough maturity by the time I got there to understand how to use it, to understand how to discipline around not becoming addicted to it, to have habits that allow me to make use of it versus be used by it. So I think the challenge goes back to the tools and the learning of that and the self-awareness of, are you avoiding something?
Well, I think the key word right there is self-awareness.
Yeah, I mean, but self-awareness is just one step to the process, right? I think people stop at self-awareness and they think, well, I heard it, I saw it, I visualized it, that's enough.
Well, I think self-awareness it encompasses everything because you have to have self-awareness with all of it.
Yeah, and then you have to take action, right? So if you don't have good habits, if you don't have discipline, then that self-awareness doesn't go very far for you, right? It's just kind of mind jerk off to thinking that you know what you're thinking. Okay, well, thinking doesn't really make reality happen. It may, deter actually from making reality happen. The inner voices, our imagination.
And in a sense, people are just checking off a box in their head. Like, I was self-aware. I took care of that. But then they don't actually take any action with it.
No, yeah. So, there's, I think, some bit of an indulgence of validation or self-validation around simply now the fact that there's so much exposure to people telling you to be self-aware that you think that self-awareness is just that. Realistically, I kind of look at it as like, I grew up with a lot of learning disabilities and emotional difficulties, and by the time I was in my early 20s, I got.
What was the hardest disability to get over?
Chronic depression and chronic PTSD sleep problems, which has led to several circumstances of me nearly dying from my brain overheating because it never rests.
Overheating.
Yeah, believe it or not, you actually need brain rest for the brain to heal from neuroplasticity and the amount of usage that you make of it.
What helped you to get over? I feel like calling it a hump is like a downplaying.
That 25 years or 30 years of that is not a hump. Yeah, that's life. That was life for me for 15, 20 years. That's all I knew. So was it mental
exercises, supplements? Like how'd you?
No, I actually
work on it.
I mean, it was so in my early 20s because I was chronic in my childhood around depression, suicide, sadness, physical pain around these variables. I was scrawny. I was insecure. I was shy. I had significant insecurities. I was tested a lot, and I went to doctors, and I started therapy at a young age. I failed out of school by the time I was 14 because you fail so many grades, and they're like, okay, well, you should not be in school. So I was 14, I already failed out of school.
At that age, did you have sleep? You had sleep
problems? Yeah, I was already suicidal and attempted suicide and had chronic depression.
You attempted suicide twice, right?
Yeah.
Was it the same? Was part of it being burnt out and then having the same thoughts? Like
I was 12, 13 years old at that point, so I don't know what burnout was.
Got it.
It was trauma. It was trauma. It was reactionary trauma. It was PTSD. It was a form of already experiencing having no value, having no outlets, having no tools, and the burn and the pressure of the environment. I think one of the most important things you can do is to learn to break apart all the pieces that are life and yourself in the context of the environment, and the environment versus yourself and yourself versus the environment. It was over a decade of work without pharmaceutical. Because at 22, when I got diagnosed, they were like, "You're a train wreck." Okay, thanks. And they were like, "You're also borderline. You're also borderline mentally retarded." And I was like, "What?" And they're like, "Yeah, you scored like 74 on your IQ test, which is literally, on the fringe." And they're like, "You're clearly not, you don't have Down syndrome. You're clearly not mentally retarded or mental retardation, whatever the appropriate term is." But you cannot process information the way other people do. You cannot capture, read, digest.
And there was no nothing on the brain. It's just lack of.
It's just the inability. It's just my brain was so. I just had a lot of chemical imbalances. I've never used ketamine like Elon is, for his chemical imbalances of uncontrolled depression, as he likes to kind of casually make.
So he does ketamine drip?
Yeah. Whatever he's doing, he's acknowledged that he's doing ketamine, and that's fine. Whatever people need to do, what they need to do. I opted for doing the actual work, and the doctor was like, "Well, that's not going to be possible." It's like you're at a state where, this doesn't have to be your life, which was new to me. I was in a state or living life by my 20s where depression and the darkness of it, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, the entire year, I was crying 80% of my days, and yet I was still having to become a D1 athlete and do all these other things. To try to survive.
Was part of this thoughts, or was it like a burning sensation? Was it like was your head always just floaty?
The way life works is you have thoughts, who drive emotions, which drives our feelings. So if your thoughts are, negative, and there's then drive your emotions, which then drive chemicals, which drive how you feel about yourself and your experience of life itself, which create your reality of life and your perspective on life. It's an engine.
And you were an athlete at this time.
I became an athlete. I didn't become an athlete until really, I came to America at 16, 17, and I went to high school here, and I got into track and field and basketball. It was never before that.
I guess what I'm in my head, I'm thinking I played basketball, football, and before every practice we stretch.
Yeah.
And stretching is somewhat meditative, therapeutic. Maybe it's a bit of a drill sergeant mentality when you're playing football, but
sure.
during your stretching, you're kind of calming down.
Yeah.
Did you have these calming down moments? Did you ever look to meditation or yoga?
Yeah. So when I was young, I was bullied, made fun of, and belittled for my disability. So it literally took me 40 years almost to most recently get over that piece of my life by actually going to the Cal Peace Foundation and doing a half marathon in Atlanta with a paraplegic and pushing a paraplegic and being part of that community and foundation now, where I'm going to be doing triathlons and Ironmans and whatever else for paraplegics as athletes. With yes, pushing, swimming, running with a paraplegic. But it took me that long to get to that level, despite everything that I've done, $5 billion companies and set records and ultras and extreme amounts of sports and activities.
And you just send me more information on that.
Yeah, and I've done a lot of things for kids at risk and a lot of things for orphans.
That I know you've been a big
$1 million in donations, and
I know you've been a big part of that.
And that's been very important because that's kind of my genesis story, and it's where my fragility and vulnerability and traumas come from, and really the future are with kids, not with us. We're already part of the problem, or we're trying to make a solution of a problem. But childhood and children are the future. So for me, when they're like, oh, you could, I do a lot of things. You mentioned, what do I do there? So I executive coach entrepreneurs. I do pro bono work where I'm changing lives every day, pro bono. So I spend 3 to 4 hours of my day, maybe 3 hours on average, interacting with strangers or casual friends or people I've known in my life and helping them change their lives. It can be money. It could be time, skills, knowledge, expertise.
Now, when you do this, is there any monetary outcome? Or
No, not for that.
It's all
pro bono. Yeah, it's really the purpose of being present in time and giving. Now, when I'm an executive coach, I'm not Tony Robbins, but I get paid very well for what I do, and I'm very good at it. How long
have you been an executive coach?
5-6 years now. And the multiplier effect of the people I work with makes my rates feel very cheap. But if you're at $2,000-$3,000 an hour, which I do in basically monthly contracts over a period of time minimum, it sounds expensive, but it's a matter of yield and impact. It's not a matter, is it more expensive not to do what you need to do to succeed, or to be cheap at what it takes to get there? Like, the reality is, what's going to cost you for not investing versus what does it cost you to invest? And fundamentally, it will always cost you more downside to not do what it takes.
When you started executive coaching, did you have a sales pitch, or did your first client come to you?
All my clients come to me.
Okay.
All referrals, all people that I've known, all people who know me through VCs, recruiters.
Right, but when you first started doing it, how did you know what to charge? That's always been a lot of people on the show.
It is an intricate process. Yeah. I was a founder and co-founder, hired gun at 8 startups. So I've been around recruiting a lot. I've hired hundreds, if not thousands of people. And I was an advisor at a lot of startups between 2010 and 2006, 2007, 17. What I learned through the advisory roles, which are often equity-based, is the exchange dynamic is counterproductive and counterintuitive over time to actually creating value. Because early on, somebody wants you on board for a reason, to solve a particular problem, to help them out in a given moment in time. And so they'll give you 0.2, 0.15, depending on the stage, equity of options, which you have to vest in a period of time because they can't make exceptions. And so you're earning it, but fundamentally, they're only going to use you in a given moment in time, or at moments in time. So you're not really valuable to their actual process. It's like saying, well, I'm just going to call on my coach when I need to lose 5 pounds, and then I won't call him for a year. How good's your training going to be? How good's that relationship going to be? How good's that trust going to be? How big is that value going to be?
Not only that, your income is also based on nothing that's predicated on anything you're actually doing.
Yeah. Now then again, I already.
And that's how it started.
Yeah, that's how it started. I was already 4 or 5 startups in, and so I didn't look at it from that standpoint. Although it was just the way the barter took place. It was equity and it was vesting. But what I learned was the relationship wasn't that productive for me or them, and I felt undervalued in what I could do. And I felt that wasn't a structure that made a lot of sense to, the contribution and the giving part of it and the yield part of it. And I'm very...
did you kind of feel like, obviously you weren't being used, but did you kind of feel used with that?
No, I actually felt I wasn't used enough in a way that mattered.
Got it.
Yeah, I only care to do things where like I said, the way I curated my startups over time was to create a formula that I had a good context to, which was, what's the value of the product in a given market? What's the market trends? How are we going to get the funding? And who is that person in terms of what this is going to take on a skill basis or expertise basis? And how do I offset that myself in 2 to 3 year window if things are not growing or scaling? And what will I be able to do or achieve? And who do I need to become? What will I need to do when this person doesn't meet the expectation of being a true founder, or their skills don't grow, or their leadership isn't strong enough, or we're limited in funding? What is that environment like? And am I going to have what it takes to be the hero to save the day as often as needed? And I grew that engine and I grew those variables over time to really profile quite well my co-founders and founders and companies that I joined in. Ultimately, I have a 75% success rate versus the 85% failure rate. So that's kind of something that I kind of mastered to some extent. And I also really understood the stages on which I'm capable of doing things on an actionable basis and solving problems and dealing with emotional volatility, including my founders, and grooming in that support and growth and tools for the system to work and to get on base. And I always had a mentality, because I never had any skills or talent, that I just had to do the work. Like I had to figure out ways to do the work, to be differentiated in how I did the work. I developed visual memory and compartmentalization of data and information and emotions.
Which is super impressive based on what happened in the first 24 years of your life.
But, humans have an amazing survivability capability dynamics in their brain. The movie Limitless?
Of course.
Yeah. For a decade of my life, I lived like that without taking drugs. My and my process to that was so extensive that I literally lived in a world, in a state where people thought I was on drugs all day.
Right. So your first startup, were you in this state of mind?
I was homeless.
You were homeless. Please.
Yeah.
Tell us about your first startup.
I started on Wall Street in the late 90s.
I was about to say, where were you living?
Yeah, well, shelters, people's couches, people's dog closets. It was very... It was right after September 11th. I actually was at the tower when the second one fell with a friend of mine.
You were in the tower. You were working
at
Enron.
At the tower. No, I was working at Enron. Enron had collapsed.
Right.
And I'd lost millions and millions of dollars. And a lifestyle of club promotions, celebrities, houses in the Hamptons, and a whole thing that came with it that I attained. I thought I owned. I thought was mine. From poverty and disabilities and traumas in childhood to my mid-20s, and having all that and believing myself to be a golden goose, believing myself to be that.
Well, in a sense, you were.
Like my father said to me, and tapped me in the back when I went to see him in his $40 million pad, and he said, you learn a good lesson. There's no easy money, and then you can go back and work at McDonald's. And the brutality of that in the context of him not showing any empathy or relatability to the fact that he had grown in poverty and I was about to become homeless and I had nothing to my name. And he was just like, yeah, this is how lessons get learned. You don't learn them if I bail you out. And my father's premise, even with just some things like simple as gifts for Christmas, was if it's not worth you working for, then you don't really want it that much. And if it's worth working for, then I shouldn't pay for it. Now, when you're a teenager or a child, when you have certain characteristic and personality traits or emotional states that are not regulated or are a problem, and you have a father who's kind of limited capacity for emotional relatability and empathy and is non-existent, those are brutal environments. It's neglect or dismissal is just as bad as abuse, and any psychologist will tell you that. And so, and that's scientifically proven. And so for me, my father was never violent. My stepfather was sexually and physically abusive to my mom. Experiencing that was, very traumatic. And they gave me a bit of a hero syndrome. Like I had to save my mom. I was very creative. I wanted to be a cartoonist as a child. And because I was depressive, I drew all day because I lived in my inner world and the world of trying to survive. Superheroes were the only characters that I cared for, I wanted to relate to, or I thought one needed to become.
And who's your superhero of choice?
Superman. I mean, it's cliche, but he, to me, was the Man of Steel. And actually, one of my girlfriends in my late teens bought me the sculpture, the statue, and it says Man of Steel on it. And it was representative of what she saw in me. And she was my first really meaningful relationship from 16 to 22, basically 5-6 years. She brought some humanity in the process of starting to believe that I could be a superhero, starting to believe that, she could see that there was this drive in me to be a Man of Steel. And it wasn't just a, hyperbole to me. It was, that's what I somehow need to become to survive. But
with all this, there's the education aspect behind it.
Yeah,
So
the education aspect really only happened for me once I was told that I had, in my early 20s, that I had, I was borderline mentally. Oh, yeah. And he was like, but this doesn't have to be your life. And I was like, well, what do you mean? He's like, well, this is, the way your brain is now, chemically wired.
So knowing that your brain is chemically wired like that,
yeah,
what are you doing to input information
he goes,
up there?
I'll put you on medicine. I'll put you on pharma. I was like, I don't want to do medication. The only reason to that was my mother was fairly anti-medicine in general. And a girlfriend of mine's sister had died of drug overdose, and my sister had become I would say kind of a weed, hashish drug addict or user. And I grew up in the projects, and I grew up around. I mean, it was just like, no, I cannot touch. I'm trying to get away from all that. I cannot touch that. And it was also the fear of like, what does it mean? Who are you when you do these things? And doctors don't actually want to talk about these things, which is, who do you become? Yep. Who are you? How addictive it is? What happens when you stop? Like, there's no real conversation about that. What are the side effects? Especially not when you're young. They're like, just take this, right? And we see this a lot with younger kids these days in America in particular. It's like, solution is pharma. No, solution is not pharma to everything. And so he said, that's the solution. I was like, I don't want to do that. He's like, well, I don't think there's any way around that. I was like, well, talk to me about my brain. Talk to me about the chemicals. Talk to me about what these are. And so I took the time to try to understand dopamine and the contrary chemicals, which there's a long list of, that create chronic, depression and chronic anxiety and chronic fear and flight modes. And
do you currently take any supplements right now?
Aminos and vitamins.
Okay.
That's mostly for muscle rehab.
Magnesium, kratom?
No.
Nothing?
No. And I said, well, I want to do the work. So I stayed in therapy. The irony, actually, when I became homeless in my late 20s, my father wouldn't even buy me a meal, but he paid for my $400 an hour therapist. And he was like, you're an asshole, but I will take that. I will take the therapist because I will take it because I'm a survivor and this is something that is for me. And I took the therapist. If I went out to lunch with him, I didn't eat, or I ate something at $10 because that's all I could live on. I lived on $10 a day for, $10, $15 a day. It's sub $9,000 a year, sub poverty in America at that point in New York City, and that was all I had. But that was his DNA. That's all he knew. That he only knew how to break you to make you, because that's how he was made. That's all he knew. That's all he knew as a parent. That's all he knew as a human being.
That's wild. And where are your siblings at this point?
The ones that aren't in the streets also are I had a sister who, I have two older sisters. One has spent the past 40, 50 years rehabs and welfare and living in caravans and, home parenting her 4 kids with 4 different men and trying to stop using some substance. And so she's unfortunately had a challenging life and, abusive husbands, whatever those things are. I'm actually going to see her for the first time in 25 years next month.
That's Crazy.
Yeah,
What's
half of my life.
Is there an event or
I made the
just
commitment.
made the commitment?
Yeah.
Where are you going somewhere to see
I'm going
her?
back to France, and that's where she lives, and she's going to meet my kids for the first time. And
That was going to be my next question.
yeah,
You taking the kids?
Yeah, I if I say I'm going to do something, I do it. I don't negotiate myself.
You didn't want to time it with the Olympics?
No, I don't want to deal with that. Friends.
That's an experience for the kids.
Yeah. No, yeah.
Not for you, for them.
Yeah, but I take them to floor seat NBA games, and I know a lot of athletes, and they get the VIP.
They get the experience.
Yeah, without the chaos and and all the people. Quite frankly, I hate amusement parks, and I hate being in large groups of people, and so they do that with their mother.
Got it.
Yeah, they'll go to Disney with their mother. Me, I'm more like, let's go on a boat cruise. I'm like, okay, I'll rent the boat.
Yeah.
Because I don't want the other 50 people on the boat with me. But if there's a 60, 70-foot yacht that I can rent to go along the river in Madrid or Lisbon, I will do that. Let's do that. I'm very experience driven. And even when I climb or I do any real activities, I'm rarely around people. I'm more of a solo driven person.
Got it. So when it comes to executive coaching,
Yeah.
I'm going to say it's safe to assume that you do impress upon them how important teamwork is. So how are you able to tell them how important teamwork is when you yourself are somewhat of a solopreneur?
No, I mean, my company's gone anywhere from 2 people to 1,000 plus people. So I'm not in my endeavors of the goals that I try to achieve for myself. I have an independence to it, and if
Got it. So you have an independence, but you do know
course.
you do know the value of
absolutely.
delegating.
Well, yeah. I mean, I train with Navy SEALs, or I have elite professional climbers with me to set records, right? For safety, and because they're the pro, I'm just there to execute. When I go climb a mountain to try to achieve something that seemed impossible to other people, I go to the best. Right, and they have to curate me to whether or not they want to risk their life.
Anyone ever be like, hey, Wilson, you're like the white Goggins?
Actually, one of my friends introduced me to some people that I coach now. They're like, yeah, we met our Goggins.
Yeah.
Goggins, whether it's Sadhguru or Goggins or the Dalai Lama or there's a lot of people to learn a lot from.
Amen.
And they all have their own characteristics and their own trait and their own achievements. Out of context, I think it's silly to think that you're going to be Goggins. I think Goggins, for what he's achieved, is also a lot of shortcomings, right? But again, to be the best as he is in his own right, in the context of what he's accomplished and does, he's given up everything.
Yep, and his marketing is fantastic.
Yeah, he's so authentic about the choices that he made, and having confidence in his narrative and why and how. That it just is. It just is for him. That is who he is.
Yep.
I'm sure there's another version of him. There's another side to him that we don't see. So it is for everybody else. And behind closed doors, wives and husbands and everything else is very different than the packaging of what's being promoted. 90% of the time, it's a shit show.
Right, and that goes back to what we were talking about at the beginning of the show, where what's absolute truth right now is what's going on right here.
Yeah, this is it right now, right? Like everything else, just imagination or self-projecting. Going back quickly to what I had to do in the 10 years, what I opted into, which was a little bit organic, and I'm not sure exactly how at that time I was thinking of it. I ended up developing personas to endeavor into the triggering of chemicals through pushing myself into environments that were giving me experiences that were out of the usual context of my depression, or that were way out of my comfort zones, but that were forcing on me the same forced experiences I had in my environment in different ways. And so I went about for a decade aggressively across 4 or 5 different personas. I became a long distance runner. I became a bodybuilder. I became a club promoter. I was a Wall Street guy. I was known as the asshole of Enron, at Enron, which is known to be a fucking group of enormous assholes. And I really went all in, Goggins style, if you will, to those personas. Not, I didn't have multiple personalities. I had personas. And those personas allow me.
Would others say you had multiple personalities?
No, they just thought I was always on drugs. That was my 10 years of Limitless. I didn't know it was neuroplasticity at that time that I was doing. I called it rewiring. In a simple term, I was rewiring my brain chemicals, rewiring my brain's thought process to emotions to, feelings. And I was like, if I can master that thought process to emotion and create, because there's so much of the world we don't control. It's like, well, can I control where I push myself into versus let the world control what is happening to me? Can I control what I choose to have happen, and can I make anything of anything? One of the greatest skill sets that I ended up developing is I'm very good at making something out of nothing and anything. And there's nothing that I'm experiencing or happens to me that isn't going to be valuable to me. But that again goes back to the process of how do you learn to trust yourself that much?
So to touch on that, what's the biggest thing you learned from, because not every startup that you've had has been a success. What's the biggest thing you've learned from your failures?
I mean, I think it's to trust your ability to get up the next morning and find a solution that gets it right versus being right, which means you're being righteous and in ego. The challenge that people have is that in friction and in failure or in mistakes, they revert back to protectionism of themselves because of the burden of the experience. And so they're not leaning into, well, I got it, so what do you do when you're like that? Well, you go with the ego, you go with righteousness, and you go with blame, right? Because that's by default the way to protect yourself to what you just experienced, which in one way or another, people emotionally are experiencing, because when you fail or you're being told you failed or the numbers show you failed, you're going to process that. Like, that's real to your mental state of experience. Those are just facts, right? And so you got to be able to then get up the next day and put your ego aside, put your righteousness aside, put your blame aside, and say, how do I get this right now? Like, what do I have to do to get it right? Above all the reasons that I can come up with, there are justifications to why it's not my accountability of it. One of the most powerful things you can do to find purpose is accountability. If you're not accountable, how do you have integrity? If you don't have integrity and accountability, how do you have purpose that you ever actually come about to making real? So because my father was so brutal, there was nothing but accountability. And he raised us telling us we would get nothing, and that you could have no self-respect if you were not fully independent in all aspects of your life, emotional, financial, right? And so to that is the enormous burden, because he never subsidized us, particularly not emotionally or financially, but you either take it on or you drown. Now, I was already drowning. I already lived in the darkness of the abyss every day of my life. So that's where I was forged. So when people today are like scared of their feelings, scared of their thoughts, like I'm like, yeah, okay, this is fine. This
Right, because you've been there.
Because I've been there, so I know how far I can go.
And from the amount of people I've spoken to on the show, off the show, just friends of mine, the people who are most successful are those who have experienced loss. A lot of times, major loss.
Yeah.
Whether it's in their teens, their preteens, or in their 20s and 30s.
And often it's on a repeated basis, because most people who come out to come from environments that they don't control, particularly in the first 18, 20 years of their life. That's the parental environment, the social environment, circumstantial environments. And your ability to survive around that, to thrive around that, kind of creates certain skill sets. It's just a fact. The CEO of NVIDIA just made this great, comments about, if you haven't really been, brutalized and, gone through a lot of hardship, you're either dependent on, things that you assume of yourself, or you were gifted as, a child, either in education or in skills, which none of them you've attained, right? If you have talent, that you didn't attain that, that's a talent, right? If your education was paid for, you didn't attain that, that's, And so he speaks to the fact that if you haven't gone through hardship, you most likely won't have the drive or the aptitude of actually evolving into the process.
Right, because talent's a dime a dozen, but it's the heart and the hard work. Being able to put that.
You look at Kobe, you look at Michael Jordan. I know they're cliches, but that's just the way it works.
Fuck a cliche. It's facts.
Yeah.
The fact, like you hear about the story about when the men's the men's national team was training.
The Olympic team,
when they're training in Vegas, and they all go out and they come back one night and they run into Kobe in the lobby at 5 a.m. and he's all sweaty.
He's already done with his workouts.
They're like, I just finished workout number one. And then the next day, another guy joined him. They're like, oh.
That's, there's a balance between fearing who you may become, that you is real, in the darkness, in the abyss, and in the suffering, and in the failure that creates of yourself, versus developing the skills to manage to reduce that and how much it defines you or impacts you or triggers you or influences you, to developing the skills that actually allow you to grow and move forward constantly. And there's just a gymnastics that has to happen around not just learning how to do the work, because everybody works hard. This is America. People have 2 jobs, they make $50,000 a year. They're suffering. They're working hard. It's not nice. It's not fun. But there's this kind of dynamic between how much mental, emotional regulation and understanding of yourself you're doing around what's bringing you downward, versus how many skills and new skills and talent are you evolving or growing or fine-tuning that allows you to move upward. And I found that, and I coach that with the people that I coach, they're already somewhere in the spectrum of having skill sets and aptitudes of being successful. They're actually short on the ability to manage why they're not growing faster or more. So a lot of the time, my coaching is fundamentally around companies don't fail, people fail. Find me a company that failed. No. The people who were leading it made a lot of mistakes, did not grow, did not evolve, right? Did not grow past who they were in a given moment in time. And who you are in a given moment in time is never enough to who you need to be to get to the next level. So a company cannot be more than its founders. Never. How can it be more than the person who's creating it? It cannot. My job as an executive recruiter, and why I kind of relate to Tony Robbins' more environment, is I have done $5 billion a company. I have coached and supported $10+ billion of founders. And I have done 35+ years of mental, emotional therapy, and actually doing the work of, rewiring myself and learning, the mind and thought process and creating the discipline and the habits to make my reality change.
So on that note, what are you reading right now?
I'm not reading right now. I'm consuming quite a bit of content. And because I have dyslexia, a very significant form of dyslexia, reading is fairly challenging for me.
So what about audibles? Because I'm a big
I think there's all sorts of ways to do it. Now I have
big Audible guy, and also Spotify. Now has
that's what's great in today's age. So there's a tremendous amount of access. Again, if you know what you're looking for and why it's the right time for it, if you know how to consume it.
It's very important you said that too, because it's consuming at the right time.
Yeah.
Because there's certain books that I will start, but it's not the right time for me to be reading this.
Yeah, because if you cannot process more than your emotional condition.
And what's the point in consuming it if it's going to go in one ear and out the other?
Yeah, I mean, listen, when you try to help people, can you help them beyond where they are emotionally? You cannot, because they cannot hear you.
That's similar to going to therapy. You gotta want. You gotta want to change. You gotta want to want the help.
Yeah, and so for me, in those 20s, I had my anger phase. You gotta process the anger. There's resentment. There's anger. There's blame. But do you become the victimization person? Do you become the narcissist person, or do you choose to carve a path that is less common, but that ultimately is who you can choose to be versus what is by default going to become you?
Well, it ends up being who do you want, not who do you choose to live with, who do you want to live with.
Yeah, and who do you want to be? I always tell people, in any given moment in time, particularly in hardship, you have to look at yourself and ask yourself, who do you want to be right now? Because you can just be who you are, which is reactionary and trigger-driven. Or you can think of and visualize and verbalize, who do you want to be right after the moment passes? Because these are all just momentary moments. Everything passes. Right? It doesn't matter how hard it is. So it's not
just a matter of checking boxes. It's a matter of actually checking boxes but making change.
Yeah, because what happens is your brain will endorse the person you chose to be in these repeated sequences, right? And you will then reaffirm yourself that is really who you are. And that's your brain's going to then reaffirm it. Will work on making sure that is what you find in your environment that reaffirms that is who you are, and then you believe you are that person. So if you're in blame, if you're in shame, if you're in victimization, if you're in narcissistic pattern, and you think that that's what protects you, you think that that's what helps you avoid, the brain will do its job, which is to make you right. That is its job, right? So it will then look for individuals or circumstances that will reaffirm that that's you believe who you are, and that's the best way to go about living your life, and it will create that engine for you. Right, and the biggest challenge that people have is to get out of that engine. That engine no longer serves you. And being survivalist is not enough to being successful. That is not enough. That's enough to stay afloat. That's enough not to drown.
Yeah, it's enough to create the identity, but then it's a matter of you. It's a matter with you to then take that identity and run with it, but actually not just run with it, but evolve with it.
You have to change. You have to want to change, and you have to go through the brutality of that, and the insecurities of that, and the fears of that, and whether it's the people you choose around you, which is a part of how that happens. And just every day, you're just. Every day, whether it's as I do a lot of pro bono work, some people come to me like, we just lost our child, 6-month thing, whatever, and they lose a little bit themselves in that, which they should. It's real, right? It's a real experience that you're losing something, you're losing a dream, you're losing a universe, you're losing.
With something like that, you really, before giving any advice, you got to take a step back and like soak it in, and understand like, I've been through a lot. I haven't been through this, but here's something I could relate it to, but I will still never be able to fully understand.
It's a whole process. Actually, you can give somebody 8 minutes a day. It's all that it takes for somebody to start altering an emotional state. 8 minutes of presence, of hearing and listening, of safety, right? If you want to help somebody who's got trauma, sexual trauma, like find trust and confidence in touch, you have to hug them for more than a certain amount of seconds. You actually have to pet them a certain amount of times for their brain to realize that the touch is not a trigger to abuse, but is actually going to start triggering chemicals of safety and soothing.
Yep, love, empathy.
Yeah, but you have to help them rewire that. So you have to be in the context of hearing and listening, but you also have to have learned a lot of skills, taking a lot of the time to work and apply yourself to that. If you haven't experienced any of these things, it's very hard to know when to actually bring those things on, when to actually apply those things, when to actually share those things. It happens that I was lucky enough to have a chaotic and kind of wild, crazy life enough to have to do all these things.
Yeah. So putting all that in a bottle, what is one book that you would recommend to everybody?
I think, the couple of books actually, because I know that was going to be one of the questions. There's 2 books that I like a lot. The Body Keeps the Score. I mean, that is...
The Body Keeps the Score.
Yeah, I can't remember but it's basically how as the brain processes experiences, right, it will either internalize it within the brain and hold it there because you're suffocating it and you're holding it down. So it's quite fascinating to think about how people repress emotions for so long and then they carry that weight while they're trying to create life and create relationships. But ultimately, as they engage in the process of trying to create versus just being reactive or being in survival mode, the body will experience the trauma on a repeated basis over decades.
I'm excited to pick this one up.
So that one is fascinating.
Any other book to recommend?
Well, it's
to anybody?
Sadhguru, it's the inner engineering from Sadhguru.
Okay.
There's a million books about business. Great.
Billions.
But the reality is, you can only go so far on reading what somebody else did. And what was right for that person has nothing to do with what's right for you.
100%.
But it is for everybody to learn how to develop emotional regulation, to learn how to develop an understanding of how their chemical brain
For
works.
that person, though. So
for that person. But everybody will benefit from that no matter what.
So Dr. Jason Selk, who's also an executive coach who I've read his books, his book, Executive Toughness, was the first book that I picked up years ago that really started my journey. And in his second book, Relentless Solution Focused, he goes and he meets with John Wooden. And him and his partner, they go to John Wooden's house, and it's one of his heroes. And they go to his library in his house, and his bookshelf doesn't have many books. But every book in there looked like it's been through a war.
Right. And you got to go back to them.
Exactly. And John Wooden's like, well, why would I have many books? I have the best books that were the best for me, and I just keep picking them up.
Yeah, because, if you read a book 10 years ago, I read the Tibetan book of Living and Dying when I was in my early 20s, and I just lost my first true love. And it was crushing, and it was in the Enron stages, and I'd just gotten fired. It was a very complicated time in my life. And I had to learn how to hold my hand open versus downward in holding that love, but releasing that love and letting it be for it to be love. And there was this whole premise around materialism and Buddhism and in that book around just the value system and where you find yourself and how you stay whole. And that book now would be different to me 20 years later because of all I've done or all I've gone through or all I've experienced. Right? And so a book of true value, of meaning, of what ultimately you can make of it. Just like anything else, what are you making of it in the given context and moment in time? So it's like relationships, right? They evolve, they change, they have different meaning, they have different values. And sometimes, one of my best friend, Patrick, like we've known each other 25 years. Our relationship 25 years ago was when we were promoting clubs and partying, and it had its own value. And now, he's lost his mother recently. He's lost his brother a couple of years ago to cancer, his dog. And we forged a different kind of friendship. Friendship to do with hardship, friendship to do with presence, friendship to do with, accountability and support, and always being available, right? And that I'm at a different stage of my life, and I have different abilities to be a friend. And so that friendship now is completely different.
And also just the now you've had empathy injected in your life for decades, but the more you've learned throughout these decades have more equipped you to have these conversations.
Yeah, I mean, I will say that the majority of what makes me a really great coach is mostly because I'm working on the human construct, and my ability to apply, what it took to do extreme sports for 25 plus years without a single injury or risk of significant death, or 35, 40 years of basically mental health, and plus obviously athleticism, plus 8 startups. It's my ability to put these pieces together in a given stage of time for a person. And because I have compartmentalization of emotions and numbers and wording, and I can formulate things, and I can text and I can process at a speed that is not common. And so I have the ability to just see through words. I see through people, not because they're not trying hard to not be seen, but because they're trying so hard. And people will try to justify themselves and validate themselves, or use certain words to try to explain themselves. And ultimately, there's always something behind that. And there's behind that matters to me. Because to me, when I'm coaching somebody who's like, oh, I'm at $10 million, I'm struggling on revenues. Like, I don't know, we're trying this, we're trying that. If I'm at $1 billion, I'm struggling. It doesn't matter their struggle, that ceiling of one individual self is going to happen for everybody at all stages of their lives. Relationships, business, health. And that's the beauty of the work. It's finding out what it is that's holding you back.
For that person.
Yeah. That's why I love coaching. I don't need to work, right? So I coach. I have my pro bono, which is a mind-blowing experience. I may show up at a dorm in a building and just give them a day's worth of pay and spend an hour with them and just learn and hear and be present with them, exchange some jokes, learn about their family.
I love this conversation because how old are you?
48.
48. So you're 10 years older than me, and I'm hearing so much of myself in you. You have been through much. I've been through a lot. You've been through more, and you have so like so many empathetic bones in your body, and you just want to make everyone around you better. Your life goal is just to make everybody better. And like, if I were to go to your LinkedIn page, I don't know what it says, but like, if I were to create your LinkedIn page, it would just say elevating everybody he touches.
Yeah, I think that's probably much more noticeable in my Instagram feed,
Yes.
Particularly in how I parent and post around that. I'm a father of 2, single dad of 2.
Right, but having the conversation makes it, because social media is fucking social media.
Yeah.
Having the conversation and actually the touch makes it that much more real.
Yeah. I certainly, that's where I focus on my social media, is sharing how I live my life versus telling people how to live theirs.
Amen.
Like, it's not for me to tell you how to live your life.
Live by example.
I can just show you what I do or how I do it or my journey. And it makes a lot of people uncomfortable how transparent I am. It's not kumbaya. If I'm struggling, I'm struggling. But I'm also going to talk about how I change that or how I solve for that.
If you're struggling, you're struggling. But also, if you're succeeding, you're succeeding. If you're gloating, you're gloating.
Yeah.
But you share everything.
Yeah, it just is what it is. That's just me. And since I don't care about comparing myself, or I don't care to be, I actually don't think about how people think about me ever. It never crosses my mind. And I'm sure people have a lot of thoughts about me. But what does that have to do with me? every day I check myself. Every day I care much more about if I got triggered by my kids and I reacted. I want to hold myself accountable to it. I will look at myself in the mirror and be like, yeah, you got to apologize to your kids.
So to piggyback on all that, what we just said in the last 5 minutes,
Yeah.
give me one word of advice. For you, it's going to be hard to think.
I've seen your podcast, so I know that was coming.
Yes. What's one word for anyone trying to make it?
Courage. I think, I was trying to figure out the word, and I was trying to figure out what really starts everything. It's courage. Because everything is hard. Like anything that just is not your doing. It just is, right? And life will make it such. But fundamentally, like if you want to be more, create more, live more, be more, give more, like achieve more, the first thing that you have to have is courage. I don't care how much you've done. I still got to get up every day and do it. Like, yeah, I don't think about when I have to go run. I don't ask myself if I had to go run. Fundamentally, that's a mistake, right? Like you're going to indulge in your emotions and you're going to try to find justification why you should wait because that's the brain. It's like the brain doesn't want to go work out. It wants what you get from it. It wants to be in that state of mind. It wants what's going to release. Your body wants that. You want that. But the brain is there to make life easier and make you survive and protect yourself. So anything that is hard, funnily, is actually contrary to what your brain is trying to achieve for you, which is to be easier, right? As long as you're surviving. So all the things that people do that are hard takes courage. Courage to have integrity, courage to get up earlier, courage to go to the gym, courage to, take the blows, courage to get up the next day, right? Like it's fundamentally starts with a form of courage. Now, whatever I would say stimulates that in you is what it is. I think we all have that. We just don't live up to that. Like we choose to, we have that moment of courage. We all have that thought. And then we let everything else take over. For me, just life is so short. And it's so, however hard it gets, if you can find your way through that, it's so beautiful. Because anything can become every day you get a shot at getting up and making choices, right? Like, and we fundamentally, you and I and most people in this country have rich people problems, as I call them. They're problems of choices. They're problems of optionality. They're problems of quantities, right? Like unless you're dying of cancer, unless, there's fundamentally things that are completely out of your control that are taking away the freedom of choice. Or you've chosen to take it away from yourself, which a lot of people do.
Right. Whether they do it intentionally or not, they did it.
They did it somehow along the way, right? And they never course corrected. What am I going to have a problem about? Like how many vacations I'm going to go on this year, or like which mountains I'm going to climb, which challenge I'm going to take on? Those are not problems. They're only problems if you make them a problem because it's self-petulant. But I look at problems and growing in an environment where there's a lot of problems and I had no control over them. Either it's an important enough problem and you solve it. Either it's unsolvable and you accept it. And if you want to know anything about it, then it's not a problem. That is your problem. It's just choosing either one of these and being accountable to that and having some level of integrity to that.
Amen. Wilson Kriegel, extreme athlete, executive coach. You're going to love this one.
Thanks for your time.
Dude,
it's good
thanks for coming.
Yeah, I appreciate it.
Woo!